You think you're being considerate, empathetic, a good person. But what if I told you that every time you explain yourself, you're actually revealing a wound so deep that it's been controlling your entire life without you even knowing it? Here's the disturbing truth. You've been trained to beg for permission to exist. Carl Gustav Jung identified this pattern immediately when he saw it. The constant need to justify your emotions, your choices, your very presence. It's not politeness. It's psychological submission. You're not being understood. You're being controlled. And the worst part, you're doing it to yourself. Think about it. How many times today did you explain why you felt tired? Why you couldn't attend something? Why you needed space? Why you were upset? Every single explanation was a negotiation for your right to have that experience. That's nonsense. You're exaggerating. There's no reason to feel that way. Stop being so sensitive. You heard these words as a child, maybe from a parent, maybe from a teacher, and something broke inside you that day. You learned that what you feel doesn't matter unless someone else approves it, that your reality isn't real until it passes through someone else's judgment. So you started explaining, obsessively, compulsively, trying to build a case strong enough that maybe, just maybe, someone would grant you permission to feel what you already feel. But here's what you don't realize. You've become addicted to external validation. Your emotions aren't real to you until someone else validates them. Your decisions aren't legitimate until you've justified them to an invisible jury. Your entire existence has become provisional, awaiting approval from an audience that will never stop judging. When an adult compulsively explains themselves, they are unconsciously trying to avoid abandonment, judgment, or rejection. They believe that if others understand their reasons, really understand them, perhaps they won't criticize, won't distance themselves, won't reject them. It's a desperate attempt to control others' perception to ensure belonging and emotional security. But this constant effort comes at a very high price, one's own psychological autonomy. By focusing entirely on external validation, the individual begins to neglect their internal authority. They no longer act because they believe in something, but because they need to justify themselves to avoid being misunderstood. They no longer feel freely. They rationalize their emotions to avoid the discomfort of being viewed negatively. Gradually, they stop living for themselves and start performing for others, trapped in an eternal theater where the audience has more power than the protagonist. Jung understood this phenomenon as a central obstacle on the path to individuation, the process by which a human being truly becomes who they are. And the truth is harsh. As long as there is a constant need to explain oneself, there is no inner freedom, because compulsive explanation is a sophisticated form of submission. It's as if, with each justification, the individual is saying, "I can only exist if you allow it. My reality needs your signature of approval." This video is an invitation to dismantle this conditioning, a deep analysis of why so many people live trapped in the need to justify themselves, and what happens when they finally choose silence, when they decide to stop explaining. Because when that happens, something changes radically. The psyche, previously bent before external approval, begins to rise with a new posture, that of internal authority, and this transforms absolutely everything. Behind the need to explain yourself, there is something much deeper than education or the desire to be understood. It's a psychic wound, embedded at the core of identity formation. Jung understood that this compulsion for self-explanation is not just a behavioral habit, it's a symptom, a reflection of something much older, the unconscious belief that your existence only has value when validated by others. This wound forms early, often in childhood, in environments where the child's subjectivity is constantly delegitimized. When a child expresses sadness and hears that they're being dramatic, when they show anger and are called difficult or disrespectful, when they reveal fear and receive disdain or irony in response, they begin to internalize a dangerous message. What I feel is wrong. I cannot trust my own experience. I can only trust the responses of others. Picture this. A child comes home from school, visibly upset. They try to explain that they felt excluded by their friends. The parent, perhaps tired or uncomfortable with emotion, responds, "Oh, you're fine. Stop making such a big deal out of everything. You're too sensitive." In that moment, something fractures. The child learns that their emotional reality doesn't matter. Only the interpretation others give it does. Over time, the child develops a defense mechanism, trying to be understood in order to feel safe. They learn that if they explain well enough what they feel, if they can make a convincing case, they may not be punished, ignored, or ridiculed. And thus, a pattern is born that will be carried into adulthood, justifying every emotion, every decision, every attitude, as if a convincing argument were needed to have the right to feel and to be. At the root of this wound is a loss of internal authority. The person no longer sees themselves as someone whose experience is inherently valid. They come to depend on the external gaze to confirm whether what they live has legitimacy or not. This creates a psychological state of submission, where self-esteem is not built from within, but from the reflection in the eyes of others. It's important to understand that this dynamic doesn't happen consciously. Often, those trapped in this pattern don't even realize that they're constantly trying to convince others that their emotions are reasonable, that their decisions have logic, that their behavior has a motive. But behind every explanation, there is a hidden fear, the fear of being rejected for simply being who they are. Jung asserted that every individual needs, at some point in life, to confront this inherited internal structure. Until they do, they remain operating according to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from authority figures in childhood, such as parents, teachers, or religious leaders. The individual becomes a reflection of what others would approve of, not of who they truly are. This compulsive self-explanation, therefore, is a form of self-abandonment. It's the act of betraying your own truth to make it more palatable to others. You're essentially saying, "My authentic self is not acceptable, so let me translate it into something you can approve." And it's precisely at this point that the healing process begins. Recognizing that you no longer need to ask for permission to exist, that your emotions, no matter how intense, contradictory, or strange they may seem, do not need to be justified to deserve space. But this awakening doesn't happen without pain. When the individual begins to silence themselves in the face of the need to justify, the silence that arises is disconcerting. It reveals the emptiness left by the absence of a consolidated internal authority. It's terrifying to realize you've been living your entire life seeking validation you were never going to receive. And it's precisely about this that Jung speaks when introducing one of the pillars of his psychology, the construction of internal authority. In the next part, we'll explore how this concept, central to the Jungian process of individuation, can radically transform the way someone positions themselves in the world. What does it mean to develop internal authority? And why is this the key to breaking the cycle of self-explanation? If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Compulsive self-explanation is not just a defense mechanism. It's a continuous act of self-betrayal, a silent betrayal, often imperceptible, but deeply corrosive to the soul. Carl Jung understood that every time an individual shapes their words to avoid displeasing, hides their emotions to maintain false harmony, or suppresses their decisions to avoid judgment, they are distancing themselves from themselves. They are, in fact, abandoning their own truth. And with each abandonment, the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be grows wider. This internal betrayal doesn't happen explosively, like a violent break with the self. On the contrary, it's gradual, subtle, every single day. It occurs when you laugh at something you don't find funny to seem sociable, when you say yes while meaning no to avoid being seen as selfish, when you explain your sadness as just tiredness because you don't want to be a burden, when you feel anger but disguise it as rationality, fearing to seem immature or out of control. With each small concession made in the name of acceptance, a part of the soul is left behind. A part of you dies. Jung identified that this type of behavior is a direct reflection of the ego disconnected from the self. The ego, which should be merely the functional center of consciousness, becomes a servant of external acceptance. It reconfigures itself to become what others want to see. And in this constant adaptation, the individual loses touch with themselves completely. They stop listening to their own intuition. They disbelieve their own feelings. They question their most authentic motivations. Doubt takes the place of inner confidence. Am I overreacting? Am I being unreasonable? Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. These questions become a constant internal dialogue, eroding any sense of psychological sovereignty. This process of self-abandonment is insidious because it's socially valued. People who adjust well, who know how to explain themselves, who avoid conflicts, who are easy to get along with, they're often praised. You're so understanding. You're so reasonable. You never cause problems. But behind this false harmony often lies deep emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of those who live for others but can no longer hear themselves. Jung asserted that this type of internal fragmentation is one of the main causes of neuroses. When the ego distances itself too much from the self, the symbolic center of psychic wholeness, symptoms arise: chronic anxiety, existential crises, feelings of emptiness, difficulty in making decisions, low self-esteem, depression, physical ailments with no clear medical cause. And why? Because the soul is screaming to be heard but has been silenced in the name of social adaptation. Your authentic self is banging on the door of consciousness, demanding recognition. But you keep shutting it out because you're too busy managing everyone else's perception of you. Deep down, what's at stake here is a crucial question. Whose life is it? As long as you're constantly seeking approval to feel, think, or act, your existence will be merely a performance, an edited version of your truth. You'll always be a character in someone else's narrative, never the author of your own story. You'll spend your entire life waiting for applause that never comes, or that comes at the cost of your authenticity. The only way to break this cycle of self-betrayal is to reclaim internal authority. It's to develop the capacity to uphold your truth even when it's not understood, even when it causes discomfort, even when it challenges expectations. This is the beginning of true individuation, becoming whole, even if it means disappointing others. But how do you cultivate this internal authority? How do you stop depending on external understanding to affirm who you are? How do you maintain silence in the face of relentless pressure for explanations? This is precisely what Jung proposes with his concept of individuation, and this is what we'll explore in depth in the next part. Because only when this authority is established does silence cease to be absence and becomes affirmation. For Carl Jung, true psychological freedom doesn't arise from social acceptance or external understanding. It emerges from the development of internal authority. This concept, central to his theory of individuation, represents the individual's ability to validate their own subjective experience without relying on the approval of others. It's the moment when you stop asking yourself, "Will they understand what I feel?" and start asserting, "It doesn't matter if they understand. This is true for me." Internal authority is the opposite of compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is anchored in insecurity, in the need to justify every step to be accepted, internal authority arises from the deep conviction that your truth does not need to be negotiated. And this shift is not merely intellectual. It's existential. It's a complete change of axis. The center of gravity of the psyche shifts. It moves from the periphery of external approval back to the center of the self, where the totality of being resides. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, including those parts others might reject. But this transition is not simple. It requires immense courage, because by ceasing to explain yourself, the individual directly confronts the fear of abandonment, the fear of judgment, the fear of exclusion. These are primal fears, rooted in our evolutionary need for belonging to the tribe. To go against them feels like psychological death. Jung said that individuation requires traversing the desert of inner solitude. It's the moment when, for the first time, you hold a no without guilt. When you don't justify yourself for changing your mind. When you end a conversation without explaining why, not out of arrogance or rudeness, but simply because you owe no one an explanation to exist as you are. Developing this authority doesn't mean becoming insensitive or closed to dialogue. On the contrary, it means that you no longer need to beg for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not as a plea for acceptance. Communication ceases to be a performance designed to win approval and becomes an authentic expression of who you are. It's the difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. In practice, internal authority manifests in small daily gestures, in silence in the face of provocation, in the firmness of saying, "That doesn't resonate with me," without needing to explain why. In the refusal to participate in an emotional game where you always have to justify your position. In the ability to say, "I'm not available," without offering a detailed schedule to prove it. In setting boundaries without lengthy preambles about why they're necessary, and above all, in the ability to endure the discomfort of not being understood and still remain whole. This last point is crucial, because when you first start exercising internal authority, people will push back. They'll demand explanations. They'll call you cold, distant, difficult, changed. They'll say you're not the person you used to be, and they're right. You're not. But instead of defending yourself, instead of launching into a detailed justification of your growth, you simply hold your position. Jung believed that this is one of the most important moments of the psychological journey, the instant when the individual stops outsourcing their self-esteem and begins to recognize it as something that arises from within. This transition is both symbolic and powerfully real, as it marks the break with the old conditioned self, the one that lives to please, and the birth of a new self, rooted, autonomous, whole. But this new stance is not well received by everyone. On the contrary, the silence that arises from internal authority often disturbs those around you. People who previously benefited from your insecurity begin to lose control over you. Manipulators feel threatened. Relationships based on unequal power dynamics start to crumble. And that's precisely why, when you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. In the next part, we'll dive into this transformative turning point. Why does silence hold so much power? What happens to your relationships when you refuse to continue justifying who you are? Get ready, because what comes next may radically change your perception of the ties you maintain today. Silence, when it arises from integrity and not from omission, is one of the most transformative forces of the human psyche. Jung understood this with brutal clarity. He saw silence not as an absence of response, but as a presence of authority. When someone stops justifying themselves compulsively, they're not only avoiding conflicts or cutting conversations short, they're deactivating an entire system of psychological control that fed on their insecurity. They're withdrawing their participation from a game they never agreed to play. This type of silence is deeply unsettling to others, because for those who have always expected you to bow, to explain yourself, to correct yourself, to apologize for your existence, the absence of justification is interpreted as rebellion, and, in a sense, it is. But not an immature rebellion, the kind that screams to be heard, that demands recognition. It's a silent revolution, an implicit declaration. I owe no explanations to be who I am. Think about how manipulation actually works. It requires a vulnerable target, someone who doubts themselves, who fears abandonment, who needs validation. Manipulative people who feed on others' doubt begin to lose the game when faced with someone who no longer explains. Because emotional manipulation only works when there's perceptible vulnerability, when there's fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of disappointing. Manipulation needs reactivity. It needs you to defend yourself, to prove yourself, to engage in the dance of justification. But secure silence, the kind that comes from internal authority, is a stone wall. It doesn't respond to provocations. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't dance to anyone else's music. It simply is, and this destabilizes any attempt at control. Moreover, relationships that have always depended on your submission, emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal themselves for what they truly are. Fragile, one-sided, based on imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease to position yourself as someone who needs to be accepted, and begin to occupy the space of someone who already accepts themselves. And this changes absolutely everything. Some people will distance themselves when you adopt this new stance, and this is not a sign of error on your part. It's a sign of realignment. It's the natural consequence of refusing to play a subordinate role. Because your silence begins to function as a filter, revealing who was by your side out of genuine affinity and who was only there because you were easy to control, easy to manipulate, easy to keep in your place. Jung said that the process of individuation often requires ruptures. And this distancing is not punishment, it's liberation. The relationships that fall away were never built on mutual respect. They were built on your compliance. When you stop complying, they collapse. And that's exactly as it should be. When you stop justifying your presence, your boundaries, your choices, you start attracting relationships based on mutual respect, not on fear or dependence. You begin to connect with people who don't need you to explain your every move because they respect your autonomy. People who understand that no is a complete sentence. People who value you for your authenticity, not your malleability. But you need to be prepared for the internal battle. Because by stopping explaining yourself, you'll also have to deal with your own anxiety. The part of you that learned for decades that you needed to be understood to have value will resist fiercely. It will want to go back to justifying. It will beg you to reconsider, to explain just this once, to smooth things over, to go back to the way things were. It's at this moment that silence becomes a spiritual exercise, a conscious act of remaining whole, even in the face of profound discomfort. Every time you feel the urge to justify yourself and you choose not to, you're rewiring decades of conditioning. You're building new neural pathways. You're strengthening your internal authority. Silence, therefore, is not just the absence of words. It's the affirmation of being. It's the refusal to put your identity on trial every time someone questions it. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it transforms into presence. A presence that emanates authority, that commands respect without raising its voice, that establishes boundaries without needing confrontation. A presence that doesn't need approval to exist. But the impact of silence goes beyond your relationships with others. It initiates a profound process within the psyche itself. Integration. When you stop justifying yourself to others, you begin to listen to yourself. When you stop rationalizing your emotions to make them acceptable, you start to feel them fully, to honor them, to learn from them. And that's where true transformation begins, because external silence opens space for internal listening. In the next part, we'll explore this essential turning point, how the authority you gain in front of the world actually begins with an internal movement, the return to your own psychological integrity. You'll understand why integrated people don't convince. They communicate. And why, when you adopt this posture, the world begins to treat you completely differently. There's something magnetic about a person who feels no need to explain themselves. Something that cannot be faked, forced, or performed. It's about psychological integrity, the state of someone who no longer negotiates their own essence to fit external expectations. Jung understood this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. When the individual not only knows their truth but upholds it without hesitation, without guilt, and above all, without the need for validation. This is what it means to be psychologically whole. An integrated person doesn't beg to be understood. They communicate, they express, but they don't convince, because they don't start from the premise that they need to justify their existence. Their words come from a solid center, not from a hidden lack. They speak from fullness, not from desperation for approval. This changes everything in how they're perceived. The world treats with more respect those who treat themselves with respect, and self-respect begins when you refuse to negotiate what's essential in you. Psychological integrity doesn't mean inflexibility or rigidity. It means coherence, internal alignment between what you feel, what you think, and how you act. It's the ability to maintain an internal line of truth, even in the face of external pressure. Even when maintaining that truth costs you something. It's when you feel something uncomfortable in a situation, and even without being able to explain it rationally, you trust your feeling. You don't need to present evidence or build elaborate arguments. You simply say, "This doesn't resonate with me," and that's enough. That's complete. That's final. This stance, which seems simple, is revolutionary in a world where most people live disconnected from themselves, where decisions are made based on the opinions of others, where feelings are ignored for fear of seeming too sensitive, where boundaries are violated with forced smiles so as not to seem difficult or high maintenance. Integrity is the opposite of that. It's the art of being whole, of not fragmenting yourself to please, of not hiding to avoid conflict, of not diminishing yourself to make others comfortable with their own limitations. Jung knew that true transformation doesn't happen when you learn more theories or accumulate more knowledge. It happens when you embody a new stance toward life. And this stance begins with the refusal to justify yourself compulsively. Because every compulsive justification carries a camouflaged insecurity. Am I enough? Do I deserve to take up space? Is my experience valid? The integrated person no longer asks these questions. They know they are enough. They know their experience is valid simply because it's theirs, even when the world insists on saying otherwise, even when people project their own insecurities onto them and demand explanations. And here lies the paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you evoke, because integrity has weight. It has density. It has presence. You can feel it when someone walks into a room. That's why, without saying a word, a centered person can alter the dynamics of an entire environment. They don't need to prove anything. Their internal coherence already communicates everything. People like this don't beg for space. They occupy it naturally. They don't react out of insecurity. They act out of alignment with their values. They don't need to explain themselves because their actions consistently reflect who they are. But there's an essential detail. This integrity is only possible when you stop betraying yourself, when you stop molding yourself to be accepted, when you give yourself permission to feel, to choose, to act, even if no one understands, even if it disappoints people, even if it means losing relationships you thought were important. This requires practice, it requires presence, it requires self-knowledge. But above all, it requires the courage to take responsibility for your own existence without blaming others, without outsourcing your value, without waiting for someone to give you permission to be yourself. And when this integrity settles in, when it becomes your default state rather than something you have to consciously maintain, the effects are profound and far-reaching. Relationships change fundamentally. The way you position yourself professionally transforms. Your self-perception becomes clearer, more accurate, more compassionate. Anxiety decreases significantly because you're no longer trying to control the uncontrollable, what others think of you. The need to manage everyone's perception of you simply disappears, because you stop living to be understood and start living to be true. But there's something even deeper happening here. Something that occurs not only in how you relate to the world, but in what you begin to emanate. When you stop justifying yourself, you start to emanate a new energy. The energy of someone who is in complete control of themselves, not in a domineering way, but in a sovereign way. And this energy is unconsciously perceived by everyone around you. This is where the invisible shift occurs. The world begins to treat you as someone who does not negotiate their essence. In the next and final part, we'll explore how this psychological integrity transforms your relationship with the external world. How, without saying a word, you come to be respected in ways that once seemed unattainable, and why, when you stop explaining yourself, the entire world changes the way it responds to your presence. When a person stops explaining themselves, everything changes. Not just inside, but around them. It's as if a new frequency begins to be broadcast, a different signal that people unconsciously pick up on and respond to. You no longer say, "Please understand me." You emanate, "I know who I am, and I don't need your permission to exist." And the world inevitably responds to this shift in frequency. Jung knew that the human psyche is guided by energy, by presence, by internal structure, not by rational justifications or carefully crafted explanations. The person who constantly tries to be understood emits a vibration of submission, of doubt, of psychological instability. The one who no longer explains themselves emits strength, clarity, authority, groundedness. And this isn't about becoming arrogant, cold, or disconnected. It's about finally becoming whole, integrated in the Jungian sense. It's about occupying your full psychological space without apology. People start to listen to you differently when you embody this authority. Your words carry more weight because they're not diluted with defensive justifications. When you speak, people sense that you mean what you say. There's no hedging, no weakening of your position through over-explanation. Your communication becomes clean, direct, powerful. Unbalanced relationships cease to make sense in your life. Dynamics where you were submissive, predictable, easily controlled, they simply collapse. Not because you fought against them or declared war, but because you're no longer available to play the same role. You've changed the rules of engagement without announcing it. Silence changes the entire configuration of your relationships because it communicates what you once begged for: respect. It says, "I am not here to be shaped according to your expectations. I am not here to perform for your approval. I am here to be." And from there you begin to attract a different kind of connection. Deeper, more honest, more aligned with who you've become. You start meeting people who don't need you to diminish yourself to make them feel bigger. People who can handle your full presence without feeling threatened by it. Respect starts from the inside out. It's not something you demand or negotiate. It's something you emanate when you respect yourself enough to stop justifying your existence. And the first step is precisely to stop seeking permission to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to be who you are. But this journey requires ongoing presence and vigilance, because in moments of doubt, and they will come, the impulse to explain yourself will return with force. Your old conditioning will whisper that it would be safer to please, easier to yield, more comfortable to go back to the way things were. And it's in those moments that you must remember. Every time you silence an explanation that is not necessary, you reaffirm yourself. You consolidate your integrity. You take your rightful place in the world, not as someone who begs for space, but as someone who already knows they belong. This is the final stage of the transformation Jung described, when internal authority becomes so natural, so embodied, that you no longer think about it. You don't consciously decide not to explain yourself. You simply don't feel the need to. The compulsion has been replaced by sovereignty. And here's what's remarkable. When you reach this state, your relationships spontaneously reorganize around your new center of gravity. People either rise to meet you at this level, or they fall away naturally. There's no drama, no big confrontations, just a quiet realignment of who belongs in your life and who doesn't. The people who remain, they're there because of genuine resonance, not because you've made yourself small enough for them to tolerate. They're there because they respect the fullness of who you are, not a carefully edited version designed to win approval. This is what Jung meant by psychological sovereignty, the state of being answerable only to your own internal authority, not to the collective, not to external expectations, not to the voices of childhood conditioning that still echo in your psyche demanding that you justify your right to exist. So now, tell me in the comments, what is the explanation you repeat the most that, deep down, you already know you don't want to give anymore? Maybe it's about your emotions, always having to explain why you're upset, why you need space, why something bothered you. Maybe it's about your boundaries, justifying why you can't attend something, why you need to leave early, why you're not available. Maybe it's about your way of being, defending your personality, your interests, your choices to people who will never understand, because they're not meant to. Write it down in the comments. This is more than just a vent. It's a turning point. By naming the explanation you're tired of giving, you begin the process of releasing it. You start to see it for what it is, a compulsive pattern born from an old wound, not a necessary part of authentic communication. And if this message confronted you, challenged you, or inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like the video so more people can find it. Share it with those who explain themselves too much, the people pleasers, the overthinkers, the ones who apologize for existing, and subscribe to the channel for more content on psychological sovereignty and the path to authentic power. The next video is also essential on this journey. Watch it now. You'll understand why the people who trigger you the most are actually showing you the parts of yourself you haven't integrated yet. Click it, your transformation continues.